The 10th of November 2024. I found Yams at his locker on Monday morning with a fresh set of bruises to his right cheek and his hand in a cast. Dude, what happened? It looks worse than it is. I took hold of his casted hand. Yeah, this doesn't look bad at all. It's only a flesh wound, right? Yams humored me with a grin. It's a hairline fracture. I only have to wear the cast for a couple of weeks. The half pipe? Yams shuffled his books into the crook of his arm and used his elbow to shut his locker. I was trying a new trick. I took his books and helped load them into his backpack. Yeah? Well, try harder next time. He shrugged. It was worth it. Sorry I didn't make it to the diner. But I was at the until late. I immediately felt guilty about thinking he'd snubbed me the night before. We started down the hall together. I wish I'd known. I would have picked up a slice of pie and brought it to you. Yams grinned. And I knew we were okay again. Next time I'll send you the deets. And then he changed the subject. Did you come up with a way to warn Peyton? I sighed. My idea wasn't great. But it was all I could think of given Daichi's warning and how Sugawara and Ushijima were watching my every move. It's super tricky. The feds have pretty much camped out in front of my house. And they're watching me like a hawk. Do you think they're tapping your phones? My eyes widened. I hadn't thought of that. Don't know, but if they are, they might also try and tap into my email and texts. We can't talk about any of this on the phone. I was suddenly very grateful that Yams hadn't tried to call or text me about it over the weekend. What if I sent her an email or an anonymous text? I started to shake my head. But he held up his hand and said, wait, before you say no, there are a ton of apps that let you send someone an anonymous email or text. And the sender's info disappears in, like, a minute. They're untraceable. I sighed. That could work. But how do we get Peyton's email address or her cell number? Yams's face fell. That. I haven't figured out yet, and then I offered up my idea. The one that had formed after looking at the last birthday card I'd received from my dad. Which I had tacked to my bulletin board at home. I think we should send her a card for her birthday. A birthday card? I nodded vigorously. Yeah, Yams. She'd totally open a birthday card. Even if it didn't have a return address. Just to see if there was a check inside or to find out who it was from. I'll bet if you dig around on the web, you could come up with her parents' home address. Right? Her last name is Wiley. And she lives in Jupiter. Yeah, I could find it. What would we say in the card? Looking at him, I knew he was intrigued by the idea. I don't know, but we'd have to be careful about it. We'd have to say something like, we heard you're getting a new car for your birthday, and you need to be really careful driving it. Maybe we could throw in something like, don't text and drive, and back it up with a statistic or something. Yams eyed me like I was nuts. She's not going to believe something like that show. Plus, we don't know for sure if that's the way she's going to die. Well then, what would you suggest? I was a little exasperated. I had no idea how to warn Peyton because, like Yams pointed out, I had no idea how she was going to die. If I knew that, then I could set something in motion to prevent it. But all I had was the date. That's it. Only a date to indicate that she was a dead girl walking. Maybe we could call her parents' house like we called Mrs. Tybalt? I shook my head. If the feds are tapping my phone, they might also be tapping yours, Yams. We called her from your phone. Remember? Yams frowned. But then he brightened. Okay, then we'll make the call from a public phone. Ask for Peyton. And disguise our voices. We could say we know something she doesn't. We know she's in danger. And we're worried that she might die on her birthday. It was my turn to look at Yams like he had to be kidding. If you got a phone call from a total stranger telling you that you were about to die, wouldn't your next call be to the police to report a death threat from a lunatic? She'd dismiss the warning, which wouldn't help her, and report the call, which wouldn't help us. What if a surveillance camera catches us using the phone? Those cameras are everywhere. We can't risk it. Yams's gaze dropped. Well, we have to try something that she'll believe show. I agree, I told him, and I meant it. But you also need to accept that even if we get her attention and she believes us, It might not prevent her death. It could still happen. Yams frowned. But even if there's a chance we can save her, we have to try. I could tell that he was still feeling guilty over not trying harder to save Tevin. I put a hand on his good arm. You're right. And we'll warn her with the card. We'll be really careful not to leave our fingerprints on it. And we'll choose the wording so that we don't come off sounding crazy. Hopefully she'll listen and be careful next Wednesday. But that's the most we can do. Anything else is too dangerous for us and could even push her to do something risky simply to prove us wrong. Yams sighed and nodded reluctantly. Yeah, okay, we'll go with the card. After school we headed for the drug mart. And I almost came up short when I saw Ma in a blue smock standing next to another employee who was showing her how to organize the developed photos envelopes. Hi, you too, she waved when she spotted us. Whoa, Mrs. Hanada. Yams was almost as shocked as I was to see her behind the counter. When did you start working here? Today is my first day, Ma said proudly. I smiled encouragingly at her but couldn't help drop my gaze to her hands. If there were tremors, I knew she'd be totally sober. If they were calm, I knew she'd be sneaking sips in the back. I bit my lip when I saw that there wasn't a hint of a tremor. I could only hope that nobody at the store caught on. Ma waved us away, saying that she had to focus on her training. We headed to the card rack and picked out one together, making sure not to handle it with our bare hands. We paid for it and headed across town to the Starbucks next to the Jupiter post office to carefully craft a message. Yams wrote the message out using his casted hand, which was a good thing because it altered his handwriting enough to make it nearly legible. We decided to send Peyton a message from a secret admirer, that part was true at least. And told her that we were someone who sometimes had strange visions that came true. We wrote that she needed to be very careful when she drove. Especially on her birthday. And in general we told her to be careful on her birthday because the alignment of the stars suggested that it was an unlucky day for her. As Yams read it back to me I had to admit that it did sound a little crazy. But it was the best plan we had. If you got this card, what would you think? I frowned. I'd probably think that some wacko had sent it. But I'd probably also listen to the message. Just in case. Yams then shoved the card into the envelope using his sleeve to cover his hands. Then he used his phone to look up her address. It took a few clicks to get the Wiley's new address in Jupiter. But we were confident our card would find its way to her. Yams then stood to head next door to mail it. You coming? But I was only halfway through my caramel latte. And it was so nice and warm in the Starbucks. I think I'll stay here and study for a while. Yams nodded, looking troubled. I knew he was wishing we had a better plan. With a wave he said, I'll text you later. And then he was gone. I sighed, fighting the feeling that I'd let him down, and poked at my drink with the plastic stirrer, when all of a sudden I heard a voice I'd recognize anywhere. And I felt a jolt of adrenaline stiffen my spine. Slouching down in my seat, I leaned out slightly and saw Kay standing at the counter joking with two buddies while they waited for the barista to take their orders. Immediately, I looked around for an escape route. But the only exit was the entrance at the front of the Starbucks. I knew I didn't look my best. I hadn't made a big effort that morning. My hair was pulled back. And my hoodie was drab and dark. I was trapped at the back of the store and all Kay had to do was turn his head to the right and he'd see me. Thinking quickly, I bent over and retrieved my backpack from the floor. I dug through it and pulled out the biggest textbook I had. Chemistry. And opened it up on the table to partially conceal my face behind it. Listening intently, I heard Kay's somewhat husky voice rise and fall as he discussed a chemistry test he'd had that day. He and the two other guys were comparing answers. I smiled when I realized that he and I were basically studying the exact same section of the periodic table. Then I heard a much more feminine voice say, Hey Kay. I stiffened, gripping the sides of the book tightly. I snuck a peek. A girl with long blonde hair stood to the side of the three boys. Twirling a few strands between her fingers she said, Can I add a caramel macchiato to your order? There were a lot of customers waiting behind the guys and it was obvious the girl was cutting the line. The way she was staring at Kay made me wonder if they were more than friends. Kay looked back at the line, offering an apologetic look to the person behind them before replying. Sure, Kendra. What size? A tall. I'm watching my weight, she said, reaching out to touch his arm and swish her hips. I stopped breathing. My insides felt gripped by a vice. The girl was pretty, very pretty. Her hair was hanging loose in long blonde waves. She wore lots of makeup. And her clothes looked soft, stylish, and oh so touchable. I stared at Kay intently. He added her drink to their order. And then he paid for everything, including hers. I didn't quite know what to make of that. Was he just being generous? Kendra kept on flirting with Kay while they waited. And he smiled and nodded as she talked. It was impossible to tell if he was into her or only being polite. But then I couldn't think of a reason why a guy wouldn't be into someone as pretty as her. The barista called Kay's name. And he and one of his buddies gathered the drinks. Kay handed Kendra's tall macchiato over to her. And in exchange she handed him a cardboard drink sleeve. I was confused. Kay already had a sleeve attached to his cup. Then I noticed a hint of black scrawl on the one she wielded. And realized she'd given him her phone number. After touching his arm one last time, she was gone. I wanted to die. I felt so queasy and dizzy that I wanted a hole to open up in the middle of the floor and swallow me. But shortly after Kendra left, Kay tossed the sleeve aside and motioned to his buddies to go. They were out the door a moment later. I sat up, counted to 10, and left my chair to hurry over to the counter to retrieve the sleeve before someone either used it or tossed it in the trash. Sure enough, Kendra's name and phone number were written in curly script across the middle. I shut my eyes and held the small bit of cardboard to my chest. So relieved he'd tossed it and any interest in her aside. Did you need something? I heard and my eyes flew open. The barista was leaning over the counter looking at me. She was close enough so that her death date read clearly, March 30th, 2070. No, I said quickly, feeling my mouth lift into a jubilant smile. Thanks though, I was just leaving. The next couple of days passed in a bit of a blur. Yams and I didn't talk again about warning Peyton. But that didn't mean we were both happy about how we'd left it. I'd stayed up almost the whole night before trying to come up with a better idea than the birthday card. But nothing came from all that thinking. By Tuesday morning, I decided to leave it alone and hope we'd done enough. As of Wednesday, there were no updates in the Tevin Tybalt case. And there was no story about a car accident involving Peyton Wiley or about her sudden death. I called Yams the minute the news was over. I think we did it, I said the second he answered. Nothing on the news about Peyton. I know, I saw it too, and I think you're right. We saved her. But then he seemed to sober as he added, we should go to the next Jupiter football game. You know, to make sure she's okay. I'll look online and see who they're playing. But it's probably going to be one of Grand Haven's teams. And since they played us last week, it'll be a home game for them. I'll ask Mom if I can have the van for the night. Awesome. I'm in. I was tingly with relief. I couldn't believe we'd actually changed Peyton's numbers. I wanted to go to the game to see it for myself. And of course there'd be the added bonus of seeing Kay again. Daichi called me later on that night to let me know he hadn't heard anything more from the feds. Which he thought might be good news. And sure enough, on Thursday when I rode up into my driveway, the familiar black sedan wasn't behind me. And it wasn't parked on the street either. Even Ma seemed to be doing better. She was given a few shifts at the drug mart. And she'd gotten through them okay. But I was still a little worried about her drinking on the job. I knew she was sneaking some liquor into her water bottle. And I was afraid her manager would find out. Still, it was better than having her sit home and drink alone all day. Her job seemed to be giving her some confidence. And when I came in through the door on Thursday after hanging out at Yams's for the afternoon, I found her in the kitchen cooking us dinner. I'm making stir-fry, she announced proudly. Awesome. I felt that bubble of hope rise in my chest. I had good news to share too. I got 100 on my US history exam. Ma's face blossomed into a beautiful smile. And she reached out to wrap me in her arms and hug me fiercely. It was the safest I'd felt in a long, long time. After letting go of me, she said, "Let's eat in the living room." We arranged 2 TV trays in front of the couch and after loading up our plates, sat down together. Ma flipped on the TV for the news. The weatherman came on and waved his hand at the area map to show us that a cold front was moving in over the weekend, bringing rain and hail with it. "We'll have to turn the heat on," Ma said, her eyes glued to the screen. I ate my dinner happily while we sat together. I thought the stir-fry tasted even better than her spaghetti. I was so lost in thought about how good she was doing that I was hardly listening when the anchorwoman said, "Jupiter police are still puzzled over a missing teen who hasn't been seen since yesterday afternoon. Peyton Wiley was last seen on Wednesday around 3 p.m. when her mother and father handed her the keys to a new car for her birthday." My head snapped up and I dropped my fork. It clanged loudly against the plate. And Ma startled. The young teen's car was found only an hour after her parents contacted police. About 10 p.m. last evening, parked at the side of the road near Westcott and Terrace Lake, the anchorwoman continued. The driver's side door was open. The engine was still running. And there was no sign of the missing girl. If you've seen Peyton or have any information on her whereabouts, police are asking that you contact a special tip line they've set up. And that number is. I was breathing so hard that I was losing oxygen. And the room was starting to spin. I heard Ma calling my name. But my eyes were riveted to the screen, where a picture of Peyton Wiley smiled out at me. On her forehead was the same set of numbers I'd seen at the Jupiter game. "Show," Ma yelled, and I realized she was tugging on my arm. "What is it?" I shook my head to clear it, and did my best to focus on Ma, but I was way too upset to hide it. "Do you know that girl?" Ma asked, pointing to the TV, and then she turned back to me and her eyes went wide. "Do you know what happened to her?" I knew she meant to say, "Do you know if she's dead?" I shook my head again. Daichi's warning came back to me, and I realized that Yams and I had just involved ourselves in what might be another murder. If the FBI found that birthday card with its cryptic message. "Show," Ma said again, cupping my chin with her hand and looking me in the eye. "Tell me, what's gotten you so upset about that girl?" I had to move Ma's attention off Peyton until I could talk to Yams and figure out what to do. "It's not the girl, it's, I forgot to bring home my algebra book. And I've got a big math assignment due tomorrow. Would it be cool if I went over to Yams's to borrow his?" Ma blinked and let go of my chin. I didn't think she believed me. But after a long pause, she didn't push for a confession. "Finish a little more of your dinner first," she said with a frown. "And remember tomorrow is garbage day. So put out the bin before you head over to Yams's." A few minutes later I was pedaling hard toward Yams's house when I rounded the corner to his street and almost immediately had to slam on the brakes. There was a familiar black sedan parked in front of his home. Damn it. Had Ushijima and Sugawara found our birthday card at Peyton's? Had they already traced it back to Yams? We'd been careful to handle the card and the envelope using only our sleeves. But what if Yams had somehow touched it and left a fingerprint? I squinted down the street. Sugawara and Ushijima were still in the car. What they were waiting for I didn't know. But I didn't want them to look in the rearview mirror and see me. So I hustled up the driveway next to me and hid in the shadows. Taking a huge risk, I pulled out my cell and called Yams. "Hey," he said jovially. "I was about to text you. My mom said I can have the car for the game tomorrow night." I sucked in a breath. He didn't know. "Yams." My voice cracked. "Show?" Yams said alarmed. "Are you okay? What happened?" I swallowed hard. "It's Peyton." I heard Yams suck in a breath. Was she in an accident?" I closed my eyes. "No buddy. It's way worse. She's missing." Yams sucked in another breath. "How do you know?" "It was on the news tonight. They found her car late last night. But no sign of her." I hesitated, unsure how to break it to him. But he'd hear about it soon enough. They showed a picture of her on the news. Her death date didn't change. Peyton died yesterday. Yams. My best friend was silent for so long that I thought my phone had cut out. But then I heard him sniffle. Oh Yams. I'm so sorry. I wanted nothing more than to go straight to his house to give him a hug. I needed one as much as I suspected he did. You're sure? He asked after a moment. His voice thick with sorrow. Yeah, I'm sure. My gaze drifted back to the sedan parked in front of his home. Listen, I have something else to tell you. Where are you? He asked suddenly. I thought he might have heard the wind blowing through the phone. I'm down the street from your house. Are you coming over? I didn't know what to say. The feds would see me. But then I realized that wasn't so abnormal. They already knew that Yams and I were friends. I was about to tell him yes when the sedan's brake lights went off. And Sugawara and Ushijima started to get out. Yams. I hissed. What? What? Listen to me. The feds are in front of your house. They're on their way to your door. Oh man. Yams cried. And I thought he might be on the verge of panic. What do we do? I don't know, I whispered. Listen, they probably found the card. Maybe. At that moment I heard Yams's doorbell ring through the phone. Ushijima and Sugawara were standing on the doorstep. In the background I heard Mrs. Yamaguchi call to Yams to see who was at the door. And I cringed. I gotta go, he said meekly. I'll call my uncle. Don't say anything to them until they tell you why they're there. The line was silent and I called out to Yams. But then I heard a beep and realized he'd already hung up. Next, I dialed Daichi, ready to confess to him what we'd done. But I got his voicemail. Why don't you ever answer my call? I snapped when the voicemail kicked in. I took a deep breath and left him an urgent message to call me back. Then I waited in the dark, watching Yams's house for a long time. At last the door opened and the agents came out. I stared at my phone display anxiously. And as their car was pulling away, Yams called me. I think it'll be okay. What happened? They didn't ask about Peyton. They just wanted me to go over your alibi again for the day Tevin disappeared. Was I sure we were together? What time did you leave my house? What did I get on the chem test? That kind of stuff. My brow furrowed. Why had they asked about all that again? As I was contemplating that, Yams added, oh, and they wanted to know why we were sitting in the Jupiter team's bleachers last Friday instead of with our school. That was weird. What did you tell them? I said our bleachers were too crowded. And we had a better view of the game from the visitors' side. But then they wanted to know why we left early. And I said because you had a stomachache. I sighed with relief. Maybe we're okay? Yams was quiet on the other end of the line. And belatedly I realized he was still upset about Peyton. Do you want me to come over? Yams sniffled. If it's okay with you, I think I want to be alone for a while. That took me aback and I couldn't help but feel hurt. I was upset over Peyton too. Sure. Okay, Yams. Call me later though if you want to talk. Okay. And then he was gone. Cold and feeling sad and alone, I began pedaling back home. My cell rang on the way and I answered my uncle's call. What's happened? Daichi asked sharply, no doubt irritated with me for the voicemail. For a moment, I didn't know what to tell him. If I came clean about sending Peyton a birthday card, warning her of her imminent death, he'd be furious and he might even insist that I move to Brooklyn with him. If only to keep me out of trouble. Then again, if the feds never found the card, if Peyton maybe threw it away or we'd been careful enough and they couldn't trace it back to us, we might be worrying over nothing. I decided not to risk angering Daichi unnecessarily. And luckily, I now had a pretty good backup excuse for calling him. The feds were just at Yams's house. Then I explained what they'd wanted. By the time I was done, I was home, walking my bike up the drive. On the other end of the call, Daichi was quiet for a long time. And that worried me. Okay, keep me posted if you hear anything else. With that, he was also gone. Sighing, I headed inside to get warm and tried not to let my thoughts linger too much on Peyton Wiley. That proved impossible, though, especially when Yams didn't text me once the rest of the night. Friday sucked. There was no other way to describe it. Yams texted me that morning that his little sister was sick, and he had to stay home with her because his mom had a meeting she couldn't miss. Not having him next to me in the hallway made me feel small and vulnerable. And at lunch it was even worse. I sat by myself at a table in the cafeteria, eating quickly. The only bright spot was Mr. Pierce, who stopped me again on my way out of class. "You hanging in there, show?" he asked kindly. I didn't feel like talking, so I merely gave him a half-hearted nod. "Good," he said with a warm smile. "And great job on the lab experiment today." I thanked him and hurried to my next class. Still, it was nice to know that all my teachers weren't against me. Later, when I came out from school to get my bike, I found it once again covered in eggs and shells. But this time Yams wasn't around with his usual wad of paper towels and sunny disposition. It hit me how much of the sting he managed to take out of all those times I'd been bullied or made fun of. After cleaning up my bike, I pedaled home. I'd checked the web at lunch to see if they'd found Peyton, or if there were any leads in the investigation, but nothing new was posted. I was anxious to follow the story, and by now I had a terrible suspicion that her abduction and death were somehow linked to Tevin's, which meant that I could indeed be sucked into her murder investigation. 2. It would also indicate that there was a serial killer on the loose. Peyton was a 16-year-old girl, and Tevin was a 13-year-old boy. They weren't very similar as victims except for the fact that they were young. Still, something nagged at me, something dark and scary that again made all of those hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. When I turned onto my block, I saw Daichi's car parked at the curb. "Hey, show," Daichi said out the window as I stopped next to the driver's side. "Your mom's at work. Feel like grabbing a bite?" I looked at the display on my phone. "It's only 3. Daichi grinned. "Feel like grabbing a snack then? What gives? We should talk," he said cryptically. I waited for him to say more, but he simply sat there looking at me until I gave in. Daichi drove us out of Poplar Hollow all the way to Parkwick. We entered a nice Italian eatery, which barely had any patrons because it was still so early. Sliding into a booth, Daichi handed me one of the menus the hostess had given us and said, "Spill it." At first I didn't know what he meant. "Spill what?" "Your mom called me today and said that another kid in the area has gone missing. She said that when the girl's photo came up on the news broadcast last night you looked like you were about to faint. She also said that you refused to talk about it. But then you bolted over to Yams's the first chance you got. So she's wondering if maybe you read for one of the girl's parents and we might have another issue with the FBI on our hands. So come clean, kiddo. What are you hiding?" I set the menu down. Daichi had me and he knew it. Yams and I went to the Poplar game against Jupiter last Friday night. We sat on Jupiter's side, and Yams pointed out this new cheerleader on their squad, Peyton Wiley, that he had a crush on. We were near enough to her so that I could read her death date. He went a little pale. "Is she dead?" I nodded. "Wednesday. Son of a bitch," he hissed, closing his own menu and shaking his head. "Please tell me you kept that to yourself." I took a sip of water but had a hard time swallowing. "Shoyo?" Daichi said sternly. "Please tell me you didn't share that with anyone." I took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "I told Yams." Daichi blinked. "And? See, Yams really did have a huge crush on this girl. So he was really upset." Daichi buried his face in his hands. "Jesus," he mumbled. "What did he do?" I took another sip of water. My hands were shaking like moths. "It's what we did, Daichi." Daichi parted his fingers and looked at me with one eye. "What did the two of you do, show?" "We sent her a birthday card." The hands fell away and revealed his slack jaw. "You sent her a birthday card? Why the hell would you do that?" Peyton's birthday was Wednesday, the same day as her death date. We wanted to warn her, but we didn't know how. And I'd promised you that I wasn't going to tell anybody their death date. But we couldn't just let her die without warning her, Daichi. My voice had risen and my eyes misted. I was starting to get overcome by what had happened. Daichi laid a hand on my arm and said, "Hey kiddo, take a breath. Tell me what happened and we'll figure it out, okay?" I wiped my eyes and tried to calm myself, feeling embarrassed because we were in a public place and I was sure I'd called attention to us. When I felt calmer, I told him what we'd done. We took the card to Starbucks. And Yams wrote out a message. He broke his arm last Sunday, so it disguised his writing pretty good. Anyway, we pretended to be Peyton's secret admirer. And we told her that we were someone who sometimes had visions of things before they happened. We said that we'd had a vision of her getting hurt in an accident. And we wanted her to be really careful when she drove her new car. We overheard Peyton at the football game telling the other cheerleaders that she was getting a new car for her birthday. Daichi nodded, but his expression was grave. "Okay, so is that all you said in the card?" "No. We also said that she needed to be careful on her birthday because the stars suggested it wasn't a safe day for her." Daichi closed his eyes as if that was the worst thing we could have written. Finally he said, "Okay, is that it?" "Yeah, mostly." Yams mailed the card, but we both were careful to handle it using our sleeves. I don't think either one of us ever touched it with our fingers. The card went out on what day? Monday. We mailed it from the Jupiter post office so it'd get there by Tuesday. What return address did you use? We didn't. We kept it blank. Daichi sighed and shook his head. "Kiddo," he said, and I knew he thought it was bad. "I'm sorry, Daichi," I told him. "We only wanted to try and save her. We didn't think it'd turn out like it did with Tevin." Daichi reached out again and squeezed my hand. "Well, kiddo, the feds haven't come around your house holding the card in an evidence bag. So I guess that's a good thing. They would have gone through everything in Peyton's room by now. So if it was there and could be traced back to you, they'd have done that by now. Maybe she got it Tuesday. Thought it was a joke. And threw it out." I nodded. I sincerely hoped that's exactly what had happened. "So until this becomes an issue, you don't tell anyone about this card, capiche?" "Okay. If the feds haul us in and ask us about it though, you'll have to tell them the truth." I looked down at the table, dreading that thought. "I know. Hopefully, it won't come to that. In the meantime, do me another favor." "What?" "The next time you see the death date of anybody who's about to die, you call me first before you send them a card or a gift basket or anything else you can think of to get around my direct order." It was clear that Daichi was trying to make light in order to cheer me up. So I attempted a smile and held up 3 fingers. "Yes sir, Scout's honor," but Daichi looked taken aback. "What?" I asked. It was his turn to smile sadly. "Nothing. It's just that your dad used to do that. 3 fingers and Scout's honor. It was funny because he got kicked out of the Scouts when he was 12 for being dishonest." I laughed, surprised by the lightness between us again at the mention of my dad. "I never knew that." Daichi sighed and his gaze dropped to the table again. "I miss him show," and just like that all the humor left me. That happened a lot with the memory of my dad. It could make me laugh and cry at the same time. "Daichi?" I asked after a bit, still worrying about the possibility of being accused of Peyton's death. "Yeah? Do you think I'll be okay?" It was Daichi's turn to push a smile onto his face as he held up 3 fingers. "Sure, kiddo, Scout's honor." I didn't have it in me to ask Daichi if he'd been kicked out of the Scouts too.